Welcome to Talk in the Park, conversations with Paul and Noel, where we gather to think out loud about what it means to follow Jesus in our world. I'm your host, Paul Pyle, pastor of discipleship at Patterson Park Church. I'm joined by my co-host, Noel Burke, one of the elders in our fellowship. Noel, tell us what we'll be talking about in this episode.
Today we are going to look at one of your articles that you wrote. This was actually a few months ago. It was the 30th of January of 2025. It was called How Catastrophe Shapes Our Faith. And I guess my first question that I was thinking about was, what caused you to read this book by Dallas Willard called Life Without Lack? Because that obviously had an influence in you writing this.
Well, the name Dallas Willard, his name is big enough. He's one of those guys that his name is going to be as big as the title of the book in the cover design. So anything he writes, he's really one of those kind of the headwaters of spiritual formation in the literature. And I found out that Life Without Lack is actually his explanation of the 23rd Psalm, which is unfortunate. The 23rd Psalm is a victim of, familiarity. People have heard it so many times they don't realize how deep it is and how rich it is.
They check out.
Yeah.
Oh, I know this.
Glaze over, right?
Yeah.
23rd Psalm, just God is our good shepherd. What does that mean? And he does a great job of unpacking it. And as he did, he had one chapter in particular where he discussed three stages of our faith, and that caught my attention. And then the blog post came out of that, really the discussion of that chapter.
Well, yeah, that was actually going to be my next question. You discussed those three stages. He mentions propriety, desperation, and sufficiency. Can you kind of walk us through those three stages, what they mean?
Well, now it's been a while since I've read it, so I can't remember if he used Job, but Job is a great example of all three of those stages. In the stage of propriety, we have kind of an unspoken agreement with God. Job would live in faith and obedience, that is his propriety, and then God would protect him and his children. And that's not hard to derive. We don't have exactly chapter and verse where he says that, but we can see that that's the way he's thinking. He's going to obey God. He's trusting God to take care of him and take care of his children. The second stage, though, is the stage of catastrophe. This stage of propriety is wrong-headed because it's simplistic and naive. We know that life is a lot more complicated than that. We live in a broken world, and the people of God experience that brokenness. So the second stage is that stage of desperation, where things pivot into catastrophe, and how we handle that. And in that second stage, I call it a fingernail faith, where we are bewildered and overwhelmed, but we refuse to let go of God and his promises. And we can see Job doing that. All the way through the book, his comforters are trying to convince him he's done something wrong. He says, really, I'm not aware of anything, but I trust God even though this is not the way. I didn't sign up for this, and we've all been there. And I had to think about Joseph when he was a slave, and Joseph when he was in prison. One of my favorite transitions is in I think it's Genesis 39:40, and the chapter begins with 2 years later, after Joseph has interpreted the dreams for the two guys, and those dreams, and 2 years later, so he had a long time to think and hold on to the promises of God. And you have to wonder, we know at the end of his life, he can look back and he say, yeah, brothers, what you intended for evil, God intended for good, the saving of many lives. But I have to wonder, in the middle of it, what did he think?
Yeah. Did you forget me, God?
Yeah. Was he able to adopt that expanded frame of reference that faith provides? Or was he lost in bewilderment and despair? But then Job gets to this last stage, and we do see this in the book of Job. The faith of desperation is a conscious, deliberate decision to trust God regardless, and that leads to the faith of ripens into the faith of sufficiency. You enter into a place of rest. Job comes to that place, what we've often called a settled life posture of trusting in God. So we've all been there. We've all been through all three of those stages. The naive stage of thinking, okay, I'm going to trust God, and he's going to take care of me. And then things don't go well. I'm going to trust God anyway. And then after a while, you've been through enough of those catastrophes, you realize, oh, God is trustworthy regardless. And then there's a settled life posture.
Do you think that do you think that these three stages are kind of more a maturing, like you only go through each stage once, or is this kind of a circle where we just kind of repeat?
And I'm glad you asked that, because I really, everybody's, well, I can't say everybody. My spiritual formation is herky-jerky, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that that's the case with these stages of faith as well. I wish that I could say once you've arrived the first time at that 3rd stage, then you're good for life.
Yeah.
But that's just not the way life works. It's not the way our wicked hearts work, or at least not the way my wicked heart works. And so we often find ourselves going through that again. And it's that refining process. The Spirit keeps putting us in the fire, and the impurities float to the surface, and He skims off another layer.
Yeah.
And He's constantly refining us.
And I think, this happens in our spiritual lives, but this happens in everything about our lives. Like, if you think about your marriage, there are times where you're like, okay, things are good between me and my wife, and then something happens. You say something carelessly or whatever, and then it just spirals into this, really uncomfortable, situation. And then you get through it and you're like, okay, we're in lockstep again. We're in unity. And then it happens again, a couple of weeks later or whatever. Same could happen at work. Same could happen with other, friendships and relationships. And that's...
Well, it reminds me of one of the talks that I gave in Albania back in the spring about emotional capital. This deep reservoir of trust and loyalty that you build up over time. And you build that up in a good marriage, you build that up in a good friendship, and I think we build that up with God too. We come to trust God more and more. We realize that regardless of how things are in the moment, we know He's trustworthy. I like to use the example of looking outside in February on a bleak winter day, and no matter how bad the winter is, you never say, I don't think spring's going to come this year, because you have this expanded frame of reference of life experience. And the more you walk with God and the more you see His faithfulness, which is clearer in retrospect than it is in the moment, the more you're able to say, in those difficult moments, okay, God's got this. He's brought me through it before.
Yeah, I recently had that experience, being on the latter part, or I guess the sufficiency side. I guess timestamp in time. There's a lot going on at work, and there have been rumors since January of, are we all going to be laid off? Are we going to get cut? And the people that just started were pretty nervous.
Sure.
And to me, I was just like, meh, if I get let go, there'll be something else. And it's because I went through that. Like, I already got laid off many, many years ago, started swinging a hammer, learning how to do construction work. Like, it worked out. It was fine. And God brought us through that. And so, when I read this, I thought, man, this just happened to me, this process. And it's like, God, thank you for helping me to grow in this area. It's not because I've done anything. It's because I know You're good, and I know You are a provider, and all the difficult circumstances that I'm going to see are going to get worked out.
Yeah, and all of it really is making real that opening line of the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And, you can say that, and it flows trippingly off the tongue because we've heard it so many times. And yet, what does it take to make that real in my heart and in my life and in my emotional frame of mind? Well, it takes going through these stages.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, and I don't think you can learn those without going through the stages.
I agree, right.
So buckle your seatbelts, listener. Okay, so you do make a final point that at the end, that catastrophe forces us to make a choice, to pivot one direction or the other. Can you tell us, how did you realize this? Was this more of an academic understanding? Was this a personal experience, or maybe a little of both?
Well, part of it was the preaching through Hebrews and realizing all of those warnings against hardness of heart, and we're going to look at that a little bit later here in the interview. But I think any of us who walked with God know what it's like to be in a dark place where you have to trust God for a future you can't envision. We all know what it's like to trust God for a future we can envision. Oh, this is what restoration, this is what health would look like. But sometimes you don't even know what it's going to look like. And you say, okay, but I still have to trust God. That's all I've got. To whom shall we go, said Peter. You have the words of eternal life. We got nothing else here. We really don't have any other options. So we have been through a time in our family when one of our kids was really sick, and we didn't even know what health and restoration would look like. And now we look at what's going on in that child's life, mature, healthy, mom, and she's doing well, she's flourishing, and we could not have envisioned that in those dark days.
Yeah.
So we've seen that, we've experienced that.
Yeah. No, that's good. That definitely goes back to that. You got to experience it to understand it.
Right.
Yeah. So, I was thinking about this faith of sufficiency, and my first thought was that, there seems to be a potential for a pitfall regarding complacency in that stage. It's so easy to rest in God's goodness. You find comfort in His grace. You find relief from difficulty that we're experiencing in the day to day. And then at some point we're tempted to allow this to kind of turn into indifference or passivity. What would you say to the Christian who's there where, they've just, instead of being like, okay, God, you're good, they're indifferent?
Well, for one thing, there's a kind of naivete in thinking that, but you're really describing the faith of propriety again. The faith of propriety does lend itself to complacency and indifference. But, once you've been through that cycle a few times, you're less likely to become complacent because you recognize that God is too good to let you stay there. He's constantly about His work of changing our hearts. That's part of the promise in the New Covenant. He's going to write His law on our hearts. And so He does that through His Word, He does that through the inner voice of His Spirit, but He also does that through difficult circumstances. And we have to learn to trust Him all over again.
Yeah. Yeah, so we kind of have this theme going is you got to experience it. And maybe it's an encouragement to that brother or sister who's there to just say, hey, this too shall pass.
I know, and that's so hard to hear when you're in the middle of it. You're pulling your hair out, and you want everybody else around to have their hair on fire as well.
Yeah.
And then somebody comes and says, God's got this. It's okay. It'll be all right.
Yeah. It almost seems like you have to have that right relationship. If you just come up to someone who's grieving and say, Romans, 8:28, that's a horrible...
That's a bludgeon.
Yeah, it is. That's not the time, dear brother or sister, to share that verse. If you are a friend and you sit quietly with them, maybe at some point you say, hey, I'd like to share several verses. And maybe that one is in the middle. But to just come with just that one,
back to Job, that's the one thing his friends did right, and they did it for 7 days. They just sat quietly grieving with Job about everything he had lost and all of his own sorrow. And then they opened their mouths and they tried to explain things. Yeah. No, when someone's in the deepest part, they need, the Scripture says, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who are weeping. That's what they need. They need lamentation alongside.
And I was reminded, the episode with Michael and Leanne McKay and that health scare. And that's exactly what a couple of ladies came and sat with her did. Mm-hmm. And that's great. Yeah. Well, let me ask you one more question. You mentioned in the article that at the very beginning that Hebrews is filled with encouragement against the discouraged. And I was just curious, you have any examples from the text that you could share that would maybe align with what you wrote in this article? Well,
I remember early in chapters 3 and 4, part of chapter 5, the warnings against hard-heartedness. It's a significant section in the book of Hebrews. And I remember thinking as we were preaching through it and I was thinking about it, discouragement can lead us to pivot in one direction or the other. Discouragement can lead us to deeper trust as we go through this process and learn to trust God and realize He's got it. Or it can lead us to hardness of heart, which leads to unbelief. And that's what the writer is warning against. He writes, I'm reading from Hebrews chapter 3, verse 12, watch out, brothers, so that there won't be in any of you an evil, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God. That's the worst case scenario. But instead of that, verse 13, encourage each other daily while it is called today, so that none of you is hardened by sin's deception. So that's the warning, and that's the encouragement. Watch out that your brother's heart isn't growing hard, because our own hardness of heart sometimes is opaque to us. We don't realize that we're growing hard of heart toward God, and we need one another for that.
That's good. Well, that's good. I'm definitely. It's a good reminder of those stages. Like, don't be shocked when you go through them.
Right. Yeah. So, Noel, what are we talking about next time?
Well, next time we're actually going to have an interview with one of our missionaries. Actually, Joey is going to do the interview.
Oh, very good. And we'll see you next time on Talk in the Park. Talk in the Park is a production of Patterson Park Church. Noel Burke is the producer, audio engineering and editing by John Ambrose. Music is composed, performed, and recorded by Jason McClurg. Check out the Discipleship Weekly blog at pattersonpark.org. Copyright Patterson Park Church. No reproduction is permitted. Join us next time for Talk in the Park, Conversations with Paul and Noel.